We were just reading from Leviticus 16, 1 to 10, Amos 9, 7 to 11, and Matthew 5, 38 to 48. It's a double parashat today, both Achrei, Mot, and Kedoshim. But I will focus this morning within the words of Kedoshim and on a very specific sentence. Actually, I'll focus on only 3 words in Hebrew, but 3 very important words. Leviticus 19:18 reads, Ve ahavta lereacha kamocha, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's probably the most famous line in Leviticus, except if you would ask some random person on the street where this verse comes from, I bet you they wouldn't tell you that it comes from the Torah. Because this verse really has become so famous because someone else quoted it about 1,500 years later. Someone who is more famous than Moshe, whose Jewish teachings traveled further than even Moshe's, the most influential Torah teacher and rabbi of all times. Do you know who it is? I'm talking, of course, about Yeshua. And love your neighbor as yourself has been lifted up, highlighted as one of his main revolutionary teachings, right? The life code of everyone who was to come to follow him. And because of this, we often think that this teaching is what made him stand out from all the bustling crowds of Jewish teachers and ideas of the first century. But actually, this teaching of his wasn't revolutionary at all. Yes, it's as old as time, but also at the time of Yeshua, this commandment, if you think about it, is hidden under a pile of other commandments all about equality and social justice. But this one commandment, it had been singled out by the Jewish scholars as the one line to describe them all, the one rule to rule them all. Yeshua was far from the only one to teach this. We can read that our famous Rabbi Hillel, about a century before Yeshua, said, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole entire Torah. The rest is its explanation." And Rabbi Akiva, about 100 years later after Yeshua, taught, "Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the great general principle of Torah." You know, we're so used to hearing about Yeshua's teachings stirring up debate and discussion in the first century crowds. Actually, the fact is that when he taught this, no one grumbled. No one called for his arrest. There was peace on the streets of Jerusalem. The Torah scholars agreed this indeed is the very core of Judaism. But still, there is something revolutionary about how Yeshua teaches around this commandment. And it's not that he's elevating it up as the greatest commandment, it's actually quite the opposite. He pairs it, combines it with another commandment, just as great, or perhaps even greater than that. Let us read what it says in Marcus chapter 12. One of the Torah teachers came up and heard them engaged in discussion. Seeing that Yeshua answered them well, he asked him, "Which is the most important commandment of them all?" Yeshua answered, "The most important is, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And you are to love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your understanding, and with all your strength. The second is this, you are to love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Now, Yeshua's teaching spans beyond both what we can hear our great Rabbi Hillel and Akiva teach beyond actually what is most often spelled out in modern Jewish teachings today. Of course, we all know that loving your neighbor is a mitzvah. So by doing that, just like with any other mitzvah, it's a way of loving God. But the connection between these two commandments that Yeshua is shining light on here goes much deeper than that. It's much more intimate than that. He binds the two commandments into one to teach us a new lesson. He is saying that you cannot love God without loving people. That if you love God, you will love people too. That they are not two commandments, they are one. And you might not have thought about this passage in this way, so let me just explain to you what it is that I mean by that. Consider the fact that you and I have all sinned at some point, broken his commandments. For sure, I've never met a person who hasn't, so I feel pretty confident that that's the case. I also feel pretty confident that some of those times when you have actually broken his commandments, you would have said that at that time you were walking with God. You were loving him. You were trying to honor him, but you made a mistake and you broke one of his commandments. Loving God doesn't make sinning impossible. He will not physically stop you from doing it. He will not send down an angel to grab your arm and stop you from doing whatever it is that you really shouldn't do. Now, a couple of months ago, I made a mistake. I bought, that's all I've done. I bought a bacon sandwich. I didn't read the label properly. I didn't pay attention. I thought I knew, and I bought it, and I put it in my mouth. You know what happened? Nothing. Now, of course, I recognized the taste quite quickly, and I stopped myself, and I fed it to the ducks, but God didn't stop me. My taste buds did. Now, hopefully, your love for God would make you want to keep his commandments, makes you want to try to stop yourself from sinning, but it can also happen that we get misguided, that we study under a bad teacher, that we are not told, or sometimes even we forget. We love him and we think that we are doing the right thing, but in fact we are sinning. You know, it is possible to love God and not keep the Shabbat. It is possible to love God and not bring your tithes and offerings. It's possible that some of you might be guilty of this, that you love God and forget to count the Omer, maybe. I'm not saying that you should, you really shouldn't. I'm just saying it's physically possible. What you cannot do is to love God and hate your neighbor. It's impossible. It is the one commandment that accidents or ignorance cannot excuse you from. Because in that moment, when your heart touches his for real, even if you've never studied Torah in your whole life, when your heart is joining with his, every grain of hatred, every ill wishing towards other people, it just disappears. Your enemies will no longer be your enemies, they will just be people. Every people with all their faults and with their issues, they will be beautiful to you. As beautiful as a sunset over the Med. I'm not making this up, it's actually in Scripture. Yochanan says this in his first letter, in chapter 4. He says, "Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister cannot love God." But you actually don't have to study Torah to come to this conclusion. I actually knew it for myself even before I started to wade through the Messianic writings, before I even knew that the first letter of Yochanan existed. Actually, this is that kind of lesson that you will probably not really understand until you've experienced it yourself. Let me tell you about a time before I met any of you guys. When I was just about to start uni and I moved out of my parents' place into my very first own flat. And I hated it. I hated it and my neighbors. Well, maybe hate is a bit stronger word, but I certainly did not love my neighbors. It was a student corridor, so you had this little room in the end of a long corridor with a shared kitchen and living space on the other side. Now, if you have ever lived in a student dorm, you probably know what I'm talking about. Imagine it's 10, 11 in the evening. You're in your PJs, just out of the shower, and your hair is a mess, and you're tired, and suddenly you get craving for toast. Now, to pursue this, right, first you have to get out into the corridor. That is probably vibrating with the latest radio pop hits, and you squeeze your way through, say, 20 strangers dancing and taking shots. And then you push your way into the kitchen. And you're quite likely to find that all the communal cutlery is dirty. It's all laying there in piles in the sink. So you dig your way through the cupboards. Maybe you'll find some kind of tool that you can use as a butter knife. So you're happy. And you open the fridge. You wade through all those moldy leftovers that no one really knows who they belong to, just to find that someone has stolen your butter and emptied your jam. Now add to that I really wasn't a people person, per se, and the 18-year-old little me was a quite shy girl. This was my idea of hell. So when I then managed to upgrade myself to my own self-sustained flat with my own kitchen, my own bathroom, there's only trees and birds outside of the windows, it really felt like I had ascended into heaven. Now, a few years later, something happened. I met God for the very first time. And in that moment, when my heart touched His for the first time, it left me changed. And one of the things it did to me was that it made me see people in a different light. They were suddenly beautiful, they were interesting. I wanted to be with them, even the stranger, even the person who never do their dishes and who plays loud music all night, although you really need to sleep because you have a test in the morning. I wanted to get to know them. It was really strange, and it just happened. Now, at that time, I had a classmate, an exchange student with a young child, a little boy, maybe 4 years at that time. And they were about to move into a student dorm, just like my old one. Only this one was even worse. This was the drug-dealing central of the neighborhood, and you had all these strange men sitting and waiting in the lobby all the time, and the police came doing nightly visits a lot. It was really not a great place to raise a child. So without thinking about it, I decided to trade my beloved flat, my little piece of heaven, with them and move back into hell. Except it wasn't hell this time. I never regretted it, even for a second. In fact, I liked it. I couldn't believe it, but I enjoyed my neighbors. No, they were an interesting bunch, and they were definitely not angels, definitely not uncomplicated. But I liked it, and sometimes I actually even missed them. What I felt was a little piece of God's heart permeating mine, His overwhelming love for all people, how He sees beyond our faults into our souls, which to Him are just lovely. I felt that, and it wasn't unique to me in any way, shape, or form. We always say that God is a God of love. And you know, if you've read the Bible, you know that God is a God of many things, right? He's angry sometimes, and he's firm, he's just, and he's righteous. But the one thing that people always tend to experience when they meet God is his love, an overwhelming, and for us, for this talk today, most importantly, a contagious love. This is why love your neighbor comes automatically to those who love God. So this is how you can judge people, actually. Do they claim to love God, but treat other people like garbage? Then they don't love God. Maybe they used to at some point. Maybe they think they still are, but their heart at the moment is very far away from his. You cannot love God and throw stones through people's windows. You cannot love God and harass people on the internet. You can't love God and try to destroy people's lives and livelihoods, wishing for their suffering. You simply cannot love God and hate your neighbor. Now, I know that we all get angry and annoyed with people sometimes. This might sound a little bit harsh and condemning if you ever been in a challenging situation, met challenging people. And it's really not meant that way. Actually, I started thinking through this message because of something that happened to me quite recently. Some of you know that this spring has been really stressful at my job. Really, really stressful. And it did take its toll on me and my colleagues. I tried in the beginning really hard to, keep people sane, a friendly word, a helping hand. There were moments when just a single smile was really useful because the whole atmosphere in the room was just so heavy. But as time went by, as I got more tired of handling all the problems, I felt like I had less and less to give, cared less and less about the other people. And it made me think about how tiredness, stress, worries has the power to leave us feeling empty inside, not caring about anything or anyone. You want to give, you want to love, but it feels like all of that love has just been sucked out of you. And all that you've left inside is just this pain and the negativity. And in that moment, it is so easy to give that out instead, because that's all you've got. What's on the inside eventually will show on the outside, and that will also damage others. You know, as Jews, sometimes we have to be a little bit extra careful about this, because it's not just about our issues here and now, it's about generations and generations of hurt and suffering. Being hated, always aware that some people don't want us here, would rather want us gone from this planet. Worries stored in our collective memory, shaping us, traumas transferred from mother to daughter and father to son. And of course, the enemy loves to trap us in this, if he can, keep our eyes focused on this pile of problems and worries, forgetting all about how love really felt like. You can reverse this if you recognize it. If you realize the depth of Yeshua's teachings in Marcus 12, it's not even rocket science, it's pretty straightforward. He's teaching us that to gain that kind of love back, all you need to do is to connect with God again. Try to sing some worship, praise him, read his word, pray to him. And as your heart touches his again, you will be filled up more and more the closer you get. How much love? That's the tricky bit. Yeshua paints us a goal, right? That we'll be so filled with his love that we will even love those who we would call our enemies. That's a lot of love. Most people are happy to love their family and their friends. Sometimes you see someone who even does something loving towards a stranger, towards someone who disagrees with them. But it's really, really rare that you see someone who shows love to someone who's hating them, who's working actively against them. The standard response of the world is to destroy our enemies. We take this thread, we're so used to seeing it, and to do something different requires you to break out from yourself, requires you to ask for God's help. You can always try to love your neighbor with your own power, but you'll have to limit yourself. I think it's often been limited through history. A lot of people try to put up their own definitions of who their neighbor is so that they can keep the commandment, define who they think is deserving of their love. Do we need to love those of a different faith from us? Do we need to love those who doesn't believe in any God at all, who's working against our God? Do we have to love the neighbors, our Muslim neighbors who are worshipping on our beloved Temple Mount? Do we have to love those anti-Semites who are spreading deadly gossip, lies on the internet? Do we? For us as Messianics, this tends not to be much of a question because we have Yeshua's teaching. And actually more modern Jewish thinkers, ideas from the more liberal and reform movement, they're catching up with us. They're starting to say that actually your neighbor is everyone on this planet. Sadly, Jewish history through time has been shaped by a different kind of thinking. Ideas that your neighbor is actually only your fellow Jew. Or even more than that, that your neighbor is actually only that Jew who agrees with you. This thought was around at the time of Yeshua. I think it's the backdrop to what we just read in teaching in Matthew 5 just before the sermon. But let's just consider the consequences of this thinking for a moment. Consider that God actually only wanted us to love those Jewish brothers and sisters who agrees with us, those who are as righteous and perfect as we are. Doesn't that mean that God himself only loves, only cares about those righteous Jews? If God only loved the righteous of Israel and hated everyone else, like some allegedly think, then there would be no one else. If God hated the Goyim, there would be no Goyim. Why would he allow them to exist when they're just causing us all these issues? In fact, there would be no country called England. There would be no language called English. There certainly would not be any places of worship for any other deity. You know, if God hated the Jewish heretic, if God didn't care about the Jew who doesn't keep Torah, then they wouldn't exist either. God is almighty. Remember Noah. Remember what he did. He could do all of that again. He could keep for himself just a nice, cuddly crowd of faithful Jews that will sit in front of his throne and worship him. He could do that if he wanted to. But the fact that we are all here in this place today, it shows that that is not what he wants. He's allowed all men to exist up to this day, regardless of their faith and their actions. Instead, we know that God created Israel as one nation amongst many. And he gave us a mission to be examples of a different way of living, allowing this contagious love of God to spread to all of those who have never met him before. It started with Abraham and Sarah. They understood the mission. They themselves biologically only had one child. But they spent their whole life telling people about the Lord, making many converts. If you're to trust Maimonides, we're talking tens of thousands of converts. This was God's plan all along, because God is not just the God of the Jews. God is the God of the world. Every human being on it is his child, his creation. However much they sin, however much they slander him, God has clearly not given up the hope that one day they too will come to him so that he can embrace them in his loving embrace, that they too can receive the instructions of how to live life to the fullest in peace and in harmony, that they too will accept his offer to take care of them. When your heart touches his, then you will notice your heart will feel the same limitless love towards people. It will. This is the one and greatest teaching that he needs us to understand. Love one another. By this, everyone will truly know that you are his disciples if you love one another. Thank you.